A simple trip to the courthouse takes a shocking turn when a black woman is stopped at the door and forced to wait outside while others walk right in. But what happens when the truth about who she is finally comes out? How will the people in the courthouse react when they realize the mistake they've made? Let us know your thoughts in the comments before we dive into this unbelievable story. Danielle Carter adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder as she stepped up to the entrance of the downtown courthouse. The air buzzed with activity. Lawyers in stiff suits hurried up the stone steps, clerks carrying stacks of files shuffled past, and anxious citizens lingered at the doors, waiting for their turn inside. She reached for the handle, but before she could step in, a uniformed officer blocked her path. "Hold it right there," the man said, raising a hand in front of her. Danielle paused, blinking up at him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a buzz cut that made him look even more rigid. His badge read Randall. She kept her tone polite. "Excuse me?" Randall looked her up and down, his eyes flicking over her navy blue blazer and matching slacks, then landing on her natural curls pulled into a tight bun. His lips pressed into a line as if he'd already made up his mind about her. "Only people with business inside can enter," he said flatly. Danielle raised an eyebrow. She'd seen at least 5 people walk in without being questioned, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I do have business inside," she replied. "I need to get through." Randall let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "No, ma'am. You can wait outside until your name is called." Danielle's jaw clenched. She shifted her stance, crossing her arms. "And what exactly makes you think I don't belong inside right now?" The smirk on Randall's face deepened, like he was amused by the confrontation. "We get a lot of visitors thinking they can just walk in whenever they want. Defendants, witnesses, people showing up for jury duty too early. If you have official business, you'll be called." Danielle's eyes darkened. Defendants. Witnesses. He had already decided she wasn't someone of importance, that she wasn't an attorney, a clerk, or, heaven forbid, someone with real authority in the building. She took a deep breath, pushing down the heat rising in her chest. "I wasn't aware that standing outside like a second-class citizen was part of courthouse protocol." Randall sighed dramatically, as if she was making this harder than it needed to be. "Look, I don't make the rules, I just enforce them. You need to wait like everyone else." Danielle's fingers twitched at her side. "Like everyone else?" she repeated. "Because I've been standing here for 2 minutes, and I've counted at least 5 people who walked right past you without being stopped." Randall's smirk faltered for a second before he shrugged. "They were attorneys. And you could tell that just by looking at them?" Randall let out a small, exasperated laugh. "Miss, I've been doing this job for years. I can tell who belongs and who doesn't." Danielle exhaled through her nose, glancing at the doors behind him. People were still walking in, completely unbothered, while she was being treated like she didn't belong in a place meant for justice. She adjusted her bag and stepped closer, looking him dead in the eyes. "You're making a big mistake." Randall's expression twisted into something smug. "I don't think so," he shot back. "But you do whatever you think is best, sweetheart." Danielle stiffened at the condescending tone, but before she could respond, another voice cut through the air. "Problem here?" She turned to see a second officer walking toward them. He was older, black, with graying hair at his temples. His badge read Jenkins. Randall scoffed and jerked his head toward Danielle. "Just handling things. She's refusing to wait outside like everybody else." Jenkins looked at Danielle and then at Randall, his lips pressing together as if he were trying to measure the situation. "What's your name, ma'am?" he asked her, his voice gentler. "Danielle Carter." Jenkins squinted. "And what's your business inside?" Danielle glanced at Randall, who still looked like he was enjoying himself, then back at Jenkins. She lifted her chin. "I have a meeting with the chief judge." Randall let out a laugh, full of disbelief. "Oh, that's a good one," he said, shaking his head. "Sweetheart, if you had a meeting with the chief judge, you wouldn't be standing out here talking to me." Danielle's lips curled into a slow, knowing smile. She reached into her bag and pulled out a leather folder. Inside was a crisp white document with a golden seal at the top. She held it up between them. Randall's face dropped. Jenkins, on the other hand, leaned in slightly. His eyes flicked to the document before widening in shock. United States District Court. Appointment confirmation. Judge Danielle Carter. Jenkins immediately straightened, his entire demeanor shifting. "Judge Carter," he said quickly, his voice firm but respectful. "I apologize for any inconvenience. Please, go right in." Randall's mouth opened and closed, his face going pale. "Wait, what?" he stammered, his eyes darting between the document and Danielle's face. Danielle simply smiled at him. "I told you," she said smoothly. "You were making a mistake." The murmurs around them grew louder as people started whispering, some pulling out their phones to record. Jenkins stepped aside, gesturing toward the doors. "Again, my apologies, ma'am." Danielle gave him a polite nod before looking back at Randall, whose face was now bright red. "You might want to rethink how you enforce those rules of yours," she said, before walking past him and into the courthouse. As she stepped inside, the murmurs followed her. She could feel people's eyes on her, their curiosity, their shock. But she kept walking, head high, shoulders squared, and ready for the moment she had been waiting for. Because today, she wasn't just entering the courthouse. She was stepping into her courthouse. And the people inside? They were about to find out exactly who Judge Danielle Carter was. Danielle Carter walked through the courthouse doors, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The energy inside the building was a stark contrast to what she had just endured outside. Lawyers moved swiftly through the halls, clerks balanced stacks of legal files, and the distant sound of a gavel striking wood echoed through the corridors. But as she stepped inside, a different kind of silence followed her. The people who had witnessed the scene at the entrance were still whispering. Some had followed her inside, their phones still raised. Others simply gawked, their eyes bouncing between her and the stunned Officer Randall, who still stood frozen outside, processing his catastrophic mistake. Danielle barely paid them any attention. She had business to handle. As she approached the main lobby, she spotted a familiar face. Judge Robert Hamilton, a senior judge who had mentored her through her judicial clerkship years ago. He was a tall, distinguished-looking man with a sharp gaze that rarely missed anything. The moment he saw her, his expression brightened. "Danielle, there you are." His voice carried through the hall, immediately solidifying her presence. If there were still people wondering whether she belonged here, Judge Hamilton's warm greeting erased any doubts. Danielle smiled, reaching out for the handshake he extended. "Good morning, Judge Hamilton. I hope I'm not late for our meeting." "Not at all," he assured her. Then, his eyes flicked over her shoulder, where a small crowd had gathered. "But it looks like you've already made quite the impression." Danielle didn't even have to turn around to know what he meant. The hushed whispers, the lingering stares, the way a few courthouse staff members were deliberately avoiding eye contact. She sighed, shaking her head. "An unfortunate misunderstanding at the entrance," she said simply. Judge Hamilton's expression darkened. He might not have known the details yet, but he could put the pieces together well enough. His lips pressed into a thin line. "I see," he said slowly, glancing toward one of the bailiffs standing nearby. "Make a note for me, will you? I want to know exactly what happened." The bailiff nodded, already scribbling something on his notepad. Danielle exhaled. It was tempting to let the moment linger, to bask in the uncomfortable realization that had just dawned on the people around her. But she wasn't here for that. She was here for something bigger. As she turned to walk toward the judge's chambers, a voice called out behind her. "Judge Carter?" She recognized the voice instantly. It was Officer Jenkins, the same officer who had stepped in when Randall had blocked her entry. He approached her cautiously, his face tight with concern. "I just wanted to apologize again," he said. "I didn't realize who you were." Danielle studied him for a moment. Unlike Randall, Jenkins hadn't been dismissive or smug. He had simply followed protocol, until he realized that protocol had been applied unfairly. She gave him a small nod. "It's not about who I am, Officer Jenkins," she said. "It's about how I was treated. I shouldn't have had to prove anything to be let in, just like the others who walked right past Randall without issue." Jenkins lowered his gaze, shame flashing in his eyes. "You're right," he admitted. "And I'll make sure this gets reported properly. This isn't how we're supposed to operate." Danielle didn't let her expression soften too much. She appreciated his willingness to acknowledge the problem, but words weren't enough. Change had to happen. "I hope so," she said. Then, without another word, she turned and continued walking toward the judge's chambers. Inside the conference room, the mood was far different from the tension she had faced outside. Several judges were already seated around the long wooden table, their discussions momentarily pausing as she entered. "Judge Carter, welcome," said Chief Judge Evelyn Moore, a sharp-witted woman in her 60s with salt and pepper hair neatly pinned back. She gestured to the chair beside her. "We were just getting started." Danielle took her seat, nodding at the other judges. Some she had worked with before, others she was meeting for the first time, but they all shared something in common. They knew she belonged here. The meeting proceeded as planned, covering upcoming cases, policy changes, and court efficiency improvements. But near the end, Judge Hamilton cleared his throat and shifted in his seat. "There's one more thing I'd like to bring to everyone's attention," he said. "Something that happened outside this morning." Danielle straightened slightly as all eyes turned toward him. "We have a problem at the entrance," Hamilton continued. "A racial bias issue." A few murmurs rippled around the room. Judge Moore leaned forward. "What kind of issue?" Hamilton turned toward Danielle. "Judge Carter was stopped by courthouse security and told to wait outside while others were allowed in freely." A heavy silence settled over the room. Judge Moore's expression darkened. "Is this true?" Danielle met her gaze and nodded. "Yes, it is. The officer assumed I was a defendant or a witness. He didn't ask for my credentials. He just told me I didn't belong." One of the other judges, a middle-aged white man named Judge Whitmore, shifted in his seat uncomfortably. "Well," he started, "perhaps it was a misunderstanding. Security is tight these days. They might have been extra cautious." Danielle turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Extra cautious," she repeated. "There were multiple people who walked in without being stopped. The only difference between them and me was the color of my skin." Whitmore cleared his throat, looking away. Judge Moore's fingers tapped against the table. "This is unacceptable," she muttered. Then she turned to one of the clerks standing by the door. "Get me the head of courthouse security, now." The room fell into another tense silence. Danielle leaned back slightly, observing the mix of reactions. Some of the judges looked uncomfortable, others looked outraged, but none of them could deny the truth. This wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a systemic issue. Minutes later, the head of courthouse security, Captain Reed, arrived. He was a stocky man with graying hair and a permanently stern expression. "Captain Reed," Judge Moore started, "we have a problem. This morning, one of your officers denied entry to Judge Carter based on assumptions rather than procedure. I need to know exactly why this happened." Reed looked stunned. His gaze flicked toward Danielle and he exhaled sharply. "Judge Carter, I apologize for any mistreatment." "This isn't just about an apology, Captain," Danielle said. "This is about why it happened and how many others have faced the same treatment." Reed swallowed. "I'll conduct an internal review immediately. If Officer Randall acted inappropriately, there will be consequences." Judge Moore folded her arms. "There better be. And while you're at it, I want a full report on how security protocol is applied across all courthouse visitors. If there's a pattern of discrimination, I want it addressed yesterday." Danielle watched as Captain Reed nodded quickly, scribbling notes on a small pad. The weight of accountability was finally pressing down. As the meeting concluded, Judge Moore turned back to Danielle. "Judge Carter," she said, her tone firm but respectful, "I hope you'll stay involved in this process. Your voice is needed." Danielle nodded. "I wouldn't have it any other way." As she walked out of the chambers, she felt the shift happening. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every black person who had been made to feel like they didn't belong. Today, she wasn't just demanding respect for herself. She was opening the courthouse doors for everyone. The weight of the morning's events settled on Danielle Carter's shoulders as she left the judge's chambers. She had come to the courthouse expecting to begin her new chapter quietly, to step into her role with the same professionalism she had carried throughout her career. But now, her arrival had ignited something much bigger, a conversation that had been avoided for too long. She wasn't just here to be a judge. She was here to change the system. As she walked through the hallways, the murmurs of courthouse staff still followed her. Some were embarrassed, some were uneasy. But all of them had witnessed the moment Officer Randall realized his mistake. The doors to the main courtroom were open, and inside a crowd had gathered. People waiting for their hearings, attorneys prepping for their cases, clerks hustling to keep up with the flow of paperwork. It was a normal day in court, but the energy in the room felt different. Danielle felt it too. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. At the front of the courtroom, Chief Judge Evelyn Moore was already seated, presiding over a morning docket. She looked up as Danielle entered and gave her the slightest nod, one filled with understanding. Danielle took her seat at the judge's bench. It was hers now. Her heart pounded as she ran her hands over the polished wood. The realization was settling in. She had fought so hard for this. She was no longer on the outside. She was here, and she was about to make sure no one else was ever made to feel like they didn't belong. The first case proceeded as scheduled, but the weight of what had happened earlier in the morning still hung in the air. Danielle handled the case with her usual poise, ruling fairly and without hesitation. But as the final gavel struck, she saw the way people in the courtroom looked at her. They weren't just seeing a judge. They were seeing what she represented. The first black woman to take a seat in this courthouse's history. The judge who had been stopped at the door of her own courthouse. The woman who had refused to let injustice slide, even when it was directed at her. As the proceedings concluded, Judge Moore stood, gesturing for Danielle to follow her into the hall. "I'm not letting this go," Moore said as soon as the doors shut behind them. "Security is being reviewed. Officer Randall is being put under formal investigation. And I am calling a courthouse-wide meeting tomorrow morning to address exactly what happened today." Danielle folded her arms. "I want to be the one to speak at that meeting." Moore studied her for a moment before nodding. "Good. You should be." Just then, the head of courthouse security, Captain Reed, approached, his face tight with tension. "Judge Carter, I wanted to inform you that Officer Randall has been temporarily suspended while we conduct an internal review." Danielle arched an eyebrow. "Temporarily?" Reed swallowed. "Pending the outcome of the review, but I'll be honest with you. It doesn't look good for him." Danielle nodded. "It's not just about Randall. It's about why he felt so comfortable assuming I didn't belong. That's the real issue here." Reed hesitated before nodding in agreement. "We'll be reviewing our training policies. But Judge Carter, he sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "I just want to say I'm sorry. This shouldn't have happened. And it sure as hell shouldn't have happened to a judge." Daniel exhaled slowly. "It shouldn't happen to anyone." Reed lowered his head. "Understood." As he walked away, Danielle felt a mix of emotions. A small victory, maybe, but also frustration. Because this wasn't just about her. This was about every black person who had ever been made to wait outside while others walked right in. The next morning, the entire courthouse staff was called into the largest courtroom for an all-hands meeting. Judges, clerks, attorneys, security officers, everyone was present. Danielle sat at the front beside Judge Moore. The tension in the room was thick. The meeting began with Moore explaining the purpose. Yesterday, something happened in this courthouse that should never happen anywhere, especially not in a place meant to uphold justice. The murmurs started immediately. People shifted in their seats. "We talk about fairness in this building," Moore continued, her voice sharp. "But if we can't ensure that everyone is treated fairly from the moment they walk through those doors, then we are failing, and we will not fail." She turned to Danielle, giving her the floor. Danielle stood, letting the silence settle before she spoke. "My name is Danielle Carter," she said, her voice steady. "I am a judge in this courthouse, and yesterday when I tried to walk through those doors, I was stopped." A few gasps rippled through the room. The officer didn't ask me who I was. He didn't check my credentials. He looked at me and assumed I didn't belong. I was made to wait outside while other people walked right in. She paused, letting the words sink in. "If it can happen to me, a judge? What do you think is happening to the everyday people who walk through those doors? To the black men and women who come seeking justice? To the ones who don't have the authority or the title to force their way in?" The room was silent now. Danielle took a deep breath. This courthouse cannot claim to be a place of fairness if bias is embedded at its very entrance. She let her eyes sweep across the room. "So here's what's going to happen. This courthouse is implementing mandatory racial bias training for all staff. Security officers will be retrained on protocol, and going forward, we will be reviewing all complaints regarding discrimination at the entrance." She straightened her shoulders. "Justice does not start when a case begins in this room. Justice starts the moment someone walks through that door. And as long as I am here, I will make sure that everyone gets to walk in freely, no exceptions." The room remained silent for a long moment. Then, slowly, someone clapped. In another. Soon, the entire room was applauding. Some stood, others looked down, ashamed. Danielle didn't smile. She didn't revel in the moment. Because this wasn't a celebration. This was only the beginning. That afternoon, Danielle stood near the entrance of the courthouse, watching as people came and went. A young black woman approached, glancing nervously at security before stepping inside. For a moment, her eyes met Danielle's. There was something unspoken between them. Recognition. Understanding. The young woman nodded slightly before walking through the doors, unbothered. Danielle exhaled. One step at a time. She turned, heading back inside. This was her courthouse now, and as long as she was here, no one would ever be left waiting outside again.